They went digging through your history, expecting to find a broken victim. They wanted a sob story they could use as leverage, something they could hold over your head, something they could point to whenever they needed to diminish your confidence or keep you trapped inside an outdated version of yourself. But what they unearthed wasn't a crime scene of damage. It was a consecrated kingdom. They came looking for skeletons, but they found a sovereign. And that's the part that completely shattered their expectations. You see, most people assume trauma creates weakness. They believe pain automatically reduces a person's value. They think difficult experiences leave permanent cracks that can always be exploited by those who know where to look. That's why toxic people are often obsessed with someone's past. They believe the past contains the key to controlling the future. But your story didn't unfold the way they expected. Because every hardship they thought would destroy you ended up building something inside you. Every betrayal sharpened your awareness. Every disappointment strengthened your discernment. Every season of isolation forced you to develop an inner world that no outside force could touch. Listen, many of you spent years wondering why your path seemed harder than everyone else's. You watched other people move through life with support systems you never had. You watched people receive understanding when you received criticism. You watched doors open for others while you learned how to survive closed ones. And if we're being honest, there were moments when you questioned why. Moments when the weight felt unfair. Moments when the struggle seemed endless. But now you're beginning to see something remarkable. What felt like punishment was preparation. What felt like abandonment was training. What felt like chaos was initiation. Because this journey was never designed to make you dependent on external approval. It was designed to make you spiritually self-governing. And that's why the people who thought your past made you weak are now facing a reality they never anticipated. The chapters they expected to shame you have become the source of your authority. And the first reason for that transformation begins with a truth most people never recognize. Your trauma was never just trauma. It was an initiation. Number 1, the initiation disguised as trauma. One of the greatest lies many chosen ones have been taught is that their trauma was meaningless, that it was simply suffering, simply bad luck, simply a series of unfortunate events that left wounds and nothing else. But what if that's not the full story? What if the experiences that hurt you the most were also the experiences that prepared you for everything you're able to see today? Because when you look back honestly, a pattern begins to emerge. The betrayal taught you how to read character. The disappointment taught you how to recognize false promises. The rejection taught you how to stop depending on approval. The loneliness taught you how to survive without constant validation from the outside world. What once felt like punishment slowly became education. Most people move through life protected by comfort. They trust easily because they haven't been forced to question what hides beneath appearances. They take words at face value because life has never required them to look deeper. But your journey was different. Your experiences stripped away illusions early. They forced you to see people as they are rather than who you hoped they would become. And while that process was painful, it gave you something incredibly valuable: discernment. Not bitterness. Not cynicism. Discernment. There's a difference. Bitterness assumes everyone is dangerous. Discernment simply understands that trust should be earned. Bitterness closes the heart. Discernment protects it. Many people confuse the two, but they're not the same thing. That's why some of the darkest chapters of your life ended up becoming your greatest teachers. If someone had asked you years ago whether you wanted to experience heartbreak, abandonment, betrayal, or isolation, your answer would have been obvious. Nobody volunteers for pain. Nobody willingly chooses the lessons that arrive through suffering. Yet somehow those very experiences produced a version of you that is far more aware than the person who entered them. The storms didn't simply wound you. They revealed you. They exposed strengths you didn't know existed. They forced you to develop emotional muscles that comfort never would have built. Listen carefully. Comfort preserves who you already are. Pressure reveals who you're becoming. That's why spiritual growth rarely looks beautiful while it's happening. While you're living through it, it feels confusing. It feels unfair. It feels exhausting. You spend years asking why certain things happened, why certain people left, why certain doors closed. But eventually perspective arrives. And when it does, the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" you begin asking, "What was this building inside me?" That single shift changes everything because it transforms the narrative from victimhood into preparation. Suddenly, your past no longer looks like a collection of losses. It begins looking like a training ground. Every disappointment taught you something. Every setback sharpened something. Every season of isolation strengthened something. You learned how to recognize manipulation before it fully reveals itself. You learned how to stay calm when other people are operating from chaos. You learned how to hear your intuition when everyone else is distracted by noise. Those aren't accidental skills. Those are capabilities developed through experience. And experience is often the language spiritual initiation speaks. This is why people who try to weaponize your past against you often fail. They're looking at your history and seeing wounds. You're looking at the same history and seeing wisdom. They're focused on what happened. You're focused on what it taught you. They see scars. You see evidence of survival. They see battlefields. You see training grounds. That's why their attempts to shame you lose power the moment you understand the value of what you've endured. Because once you recognize that your hardest seasons were preparing you rather than destroying you, your entire relationship with the past changes. And when that happens, something extraordinary begins to emerge. You stop searching for permission to sit at someone else's table. You stop begging for acceptance from people who never intended to give it. You stop measuring your worth through the opinions of those who never understood your journey. Instead, you begin building something internal, something stable, something sovereign. Because one of the greatest gifts hidden inside abandonment is that it eventually teaches you how to become your own source of validation. And that's exactly where the next chapter of this story begins. Number 2, turning abandonment into sovereignty. One of the most painful experiences a chosen one can endure is being left behind by people they genuinely cared about. Not because the loss itself is always what hurts the most, but because of what the loss seems to say. When someone walks away, when a family turns cold, when friends disappear, when support vanishes during the moments you need it most, it's easy to believe you've been abandoned because there is something wrong with you. That's the conclusion many people reach. And that's exactly where they get stuck. Because what feels like abandonment is often the beginning of separation. And separation is one of the oldest forms of spiritual training that exists. Think about it. As long as people keep validating you, you never have to discover whether you validate yourself. As long as everyone keeps supporting your decisions, you never have to develop your own conviction. As long as approval remains available, you never truly learn how dependent you've become on receiving it. That's why some of the most transformative seasons in life begin when external support disappears. Not because heaven is punishing you, because heaven is revealing you to yourself. At first, the experience feels brutal. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder what you could have done differently. You revisit old memories, searching for answers. You try to understand why people who once claimed to care suddenly became distant. You question your value. You question your judgment. Sometimes you even question your entire identity. But then something unexpected starts happening. Little by little, you stop asking them to explain your worth. Little by little, you stop chasing closure. Little by little, you stop seeking permission to exist as yourself. And without realizing it, you're building something incredibly powerful. An internal throne. Most people spend their lives sitting on chairs built by other people. Their confidence depends on approval. Their identity depends on acceptance. Their peace depends on belonging. Remove those things, and everything falls apart. But when you've survived abandonment, eventually you're forced to create something stronger. You're forced to develop self-respect that doesn't depend on applause. Self-trust that doesn't depend on agreement. Confidence that doesn't disappear when someone withdraws affection. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty is dangerous to controlling people. Because once someone discovers their own internal authority, manipulation becomes far less effective. Think about how many toxic relationships survive through the fear of rejection. Think about how many unhealthy systems survive because people are terrified of being excluded. Think about how many individuals remain trapped simply because they cannot imagine life without the approval they're chasing. Now imagine what happens when someone overcomes that fear. Imagine what happens when someone learns they can survive being misunderstood. They can survive being excluded. They can survive being judged. They can survive being left behind. Suddenly the threat loses its power. That's why some people become frustrated when they can no longer control you the way they once did. The methods that used to work stop working. The emotional hooks lose their effectiveness. The guilt doesn't land the same way. The pressure no longer produces the desired reaction. What changed? You did. Not because you became cold. Not because you stopped caring. But because you stopped placing your identity in the hands of people who were never qualified to define it. Listen carefully. Some of the people who left your life were never meant to accompany you into your next chapter. Their departure felt like loss because you couldn't yet see what their absence was making possible. Sometimes the removal of external support is the very thing that forces internal strength to emerge. Sometimes the empty space left behind becomes the place where self-respect finally grows. And that's what happened to many of you. The abandonment that once felt devastating eventually became liberating. The rejection that once felt personal eventually became directional. The doors that closed eventually pushed you toward doors you never would have discovered otherwise. Today, when people look at you, they may see confidence. They may see calmness. They may see resilience. What they don't see are all the moments that built it. The nights you questioned everything. The mornings you got up anyway. The seasons when nobody was coming to save you, so you learned how to save yourself. That's why the people who try to use your past against you misunderstand something fundamental. The abandonment didn't destroy your kingdom. It built it. Because every time someone walked away, you were forced to walk deeper into yourself. Every time someone withdrew approval, you were forced to discover your own value. Every time someone refused to choose you, you learned how to choose yourself. And once a chosen one learns that lesson, something extraordinary begins to happen. Every mistake, every heartbreak, every failure, every painful chapter stops being a source of shame. It becomes a source of wisdom. And that's where your greatest transformation truly begins. Number 3, the Living Spellbook. One of the biggest reasons people fail when they try to use your past against you is because they only study the events. They never study the transformation that happened afterward. They look at the heartbreak, but they don't see the wisdom it created. They look at the betrayal, but they don't see the discernment it produced. They look at the mistakes, but they don't see the awareness that emerged from them. In their minds, your past is a collection of weaknesses waiting to be exposed. What they don't realize is that every difficult chapter left behind something far more valuable than pain. It left knowledge. It left insight. It left understanding. Over time, those lessons accumulated until they became something like a personal operating system, a private archive of wisdom built through lived experience rather than theory. That's what separates many chosen ones from the people attempting to judge them. You no longer operate from assumptions. You operate from experience. When you've been lied to enough times, you begin recognizing inconsistencies before they fully reveal themselves. When you've survived manipulation, you start noticing patterns hidden beneath words. When you've watched masks fall enough times, you become less interested in appearances and more interested in character. None of those abilities came from books. None of them came from motivational speeches. They were earned through life itself. The experiences that once felt unfair eventually became teachers. The lessons were expensive, but they were real. And lessons learned through experience tend to stay with you forever. Think about who you were before some of your biggest wake-up calls. Before certain betrayals. Before certain disappointments. Before life forced you to see people and situations more clearly. Chances are you trusted more easily. Chances are you ignored warning signs because you wanted to believe the best in everyone. Chances are you gave access to people who had not earned it. That wasn't weakness. That was innocence. But innocence eventually matures into wisdom when it's tested by reality. The person you are today sees things differently because life demanded that you grow differently. You now recognize the difference between someone's words and someone's patterns. You understand that consistency reveals more than promises. You understand that true intentions eventually appear through behavior. These are not small lessons. They are forms of protection. This is why I call it a living spellbook. Not because it contains magic, but because it contains accumulated wisdom. Every chapter of your life contributed something to it. Every mistake added a lesson. Every disappointment added clarity. Every heartbreak added understanding. Every season of loneliness taught you something about yourself that comfort never could. What once felt like random suffering slowly became a collection of insights that now guide your decisions. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed. It became information. It became discernment. It became part of your internal guidance system. And once that transformation happens, your past stops functioning as a source of shame. It becomes a source of authority. That's why people become so confused when they attempt to use your history against you. They expect embarrassment. They expect guilt. They expect emotional reactions. Instead, they encounter someone who has already studied every chapter they are trying to expose. Someone who has already faced those truths in private. Someone who has already extracted the lessons hidden inside the pain. They arrive expecting wounds and discover wisdom. They arrive expecting insecurity and discover acceptance. They arrive expecting unresolved trauma and discover peace. And nothing frustrates a manipulative person more than realizing the thing they plan to use as a weapon has already been transformed into strength. The truth is, your history no longer belongs to your enemies. It doesn't even belong to your mistakes. It belongs to your growth. Every difficult season became part of the kingdom you were building inside yourself. Every lesson became another layer of protection. Every scar became another reminder of what you've survived. That's why your past cannot be used to control you the way it once could. You've already integrated it. You've already learned from it. You've already made peace with it. And that's exactly what shocks the people who go digging through your history looking for leverage. Because instead of finding someone haunted by the past, they find someone who has completely made peace with it. Number 4, the shock of the investigator. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey when the people investigating them realize they've made a serious miscalculation. At first, they feel confident. They believe the past contains the key to controlling you. They assume that if they dig deep enough, ask enough questions, uncover enough details, they'll eventually find something they can use. Maybe an old mistake. Maybe a painful chapter. Maybe a season of your life you'd rather forget. Their entire strategy depends on one assumption: that you are still emotionally chained to the person you used to be. But that's where everything begins to fall apart. Because while they were busy collecting information, they never stopped to ask a more important question. What if you've already faced all of it? What if you've already sat alone with those memories? What if you've already cried those tears, learned those lessons, accepted those truths, and made peace with the chapters they're trying so desperately to expose? You see, manipulative people often believe hidden pain equals hidden power. They assume that every scar remains sensitive forever. They assume that every mistake remains a source of shame forever. They assume that every difficult memory remains an open wound forever. What they fail to understand is that healing changes the entire equation. Once a person fully accepts their past, the emotional leverage disappears. That's why the encounter becomes so shocking. They arrive expecting defensiveness and find honesty. They arrive expecting embarrassment and find acceptance. They arrive expecting emotional chaos and find calmness. The reaction they rehearsed in their minds never appears because the version of you they prepared for no longer exists. Think about how disorienting that is for someone whose strategy depends on emotional control. They mention something from your past expecting you to shrink, but you don't. They reference a difficult chapter expecting you to panic, but you remain composed. They bring up old failures expecting you to become defensive, but you acknowledge them openly. Suddenly the entire dynamic shifts. The information they thought was powerful starts losing value in real time because power only exists where shame still survives. And that's the part they never anticipated. The chosen one already knows. The chosen one already remembers. The chosen one already accepted it. There is no revelation because there is nothing left to reveal. Listen carefully. One of the highest forms of freedom is reaching a place where your history no longer terrifies you. Not because you're proud of every decision. Not because every chapter was beautiful. But because you've stopped running from reality. You've stopped needing a perfect story. You've stopped demanding that your past look different than it does. You understand that every chapter, good and bad, played a role in creating who you are today. That level of acceptance creates something almost impossible to manipulate. Because shame survives in secrecy. Fear survives in avoidance. Control survives in denial. But once those things disappear, the entire structure collapses. This is why so many chosen ones eventually become untouchable in ways that confuse people. It's not because they have no flaws. It's not because they've lived perfect lives. It's because they've already done the internal work most people spend their lives avoiding. They've confronted their failures. They've faced their regrets. They've examined their wounds. They've learned from them instead of hiding from them. And when someone has done that kind of work, external attacks begin losing effectiveness. The investigator arrives expecting to find unresolved darkness. Instead, they find integration. They expect emotional instability. Instead, they find wisdom. They expect shame. Instead, they find peace. And nothing is more frustrating for a person seeking leverage than discovering there is none. Because at that moment, they realize something uncomfortable. The story they hoped would weaken you is actually part of what made you strong. The chapters they expected to use against you have already been transformed into understanding. The pain they thought would define you has become one of the reasons you can no longer be controlled. That's when the investigation ends. Not because they found what they were looking for, but because they discovered something they never expected. A sovereign who has already made peace with the kingdom they came to judge. And that realization leads to an even deeper truth. Because the greatest evidence of spiritual maturity isn't avoiding darkness. It's walking through darkness without becoming it. Number 5. Mastering the darkness. One of the greatest misunderstandings about spiritual strength is the belief that it comes from avoiding darkness. It doesn't. True spiritual strength comes from facing darkness without becoming consumed by it. That's what makes your journey different. Many people have experienced pain. Many people have encountered betrayal, temptation, injustice, or disappointment. But not everyone comes through those experiences with their integrity intact. Some become bitter. Some become cynical. Some become the very thing that once wounded them. They allow pain to reshape their character. They allow suffering to justify behavior they once condemned. But you chose a different path. And that choice matters more than you realize. Because every difficult season placed a question in front of you. Every betrayal asked whether you would become dishonest too. Every act of cruelty asked whether you would become cruel. Every manipulation asked whether you would start manipulating others. Every disappointment tempted you to abandon your values and operate from the same darkness that hurt you. Yet somehow, despite everything you faced, you continued choosing differently. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but intentionally. That's what heaven notices. Listen carefully. Anyone can remain kind when life is easy. Anyone can maintain their values when they have never been tested. Anyone can speak about integrity when there is no cost attached to it. The real measure of character appears when a person has every reason to become bitter and still chooses wisdom. When a person has every reason to seek revenge and still chooses peace. When a person has every reason to lose faith and still chooses growth. That's the initiation many people never complete. They survive the darkness physically, but become consumed by it spiritually. You didn't. You walked through it. You learned from it. You carried the lessons forward without carrying the poison forward. And that's why your scars are different. They're not reminders of defeat. They're evidence of mastery. Evidence that you've seen deception and chosen honesty. Evidence that you've experienced rejection and still kept your heart open. Evidence that you've encountered darkness without surrendering your soul to it. That's why the people studying your past become confused. They're expecting to find damage. They're expecting to find weakness. They're expecting to find unresolved wounds. Instead, they find someone who has transformed suffering into wisdom. Someone who has transformed pain into discernment. Someone who has transformed survival into leadership. And that's the final secret they never understand. Your trauma wasn't the end of your story. It was the initiation that revealed who you were always becoming. So if you've spent years feeling ashamed of your past, let this be the moment that changes the way you see it. The people who tried to define you by your worst seasons never understood what those seasons actually created. They saw the abandonment, but they never saw the sovereignty. They saw the heartbreak, but they never saw the wisdom. They saw the scars, but they never saw the kingdom that was being built beneath them. And maybe that's because kingdoms are rarely visible while they're under construction. Listen, you didn't become who you are despite everything you survived. You became who you are through it. The betrayal sharpened you. The loneliness strengthened you. The disappointments refined you. The mistakes humbled you. The losses taught you. Every chapter contributed something. Every battle left behind a lesson. Every dark season added another stone to the foundation of the person you've become. That's why your past is no longer evidence against you. It's evidence of your transformation. The very experiences that once made you question your worth are now proof of your resilience. The very stories people thought would diminish your power have become part of the reason your power exists in the first place. So stop looking at your scars as damage. Start seeing them as sacred architecture. Proof that something stronger was being built. Proof that what tried to break you ultimately revealed you. Proof that your life was never a tragedy. It was an initiation. If this message resonated with you, comment below. My scars built my kingdom. And if you're ready for more messages like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and join this community of chosen ones who are learning to see their past through the eyes of wisdom instead of shame. Remember this. They went digging through your history, looking for a victim. What they found was a sovereign.